Hello and welcome. Welcome to our third discussion of the history of the Holocaust and the history of evil. Today we're turning to what I regard as a very important book, the book Black Earth by Timothy Snyder, who's an historian at Yale University. You've already heard Timothy Snyder speaking of his historical research in the video that you watched for session 1. But I think Snyder is an especially important historian for us to consider for a couple of reasons. First of all, maybe most importantly, he is an historian who has a particularly deep empathy with the human realities which he describes. He cares about the human beings who were killed, tortured, degraded, enslaved, raped during the period of the Holocaust, the Holodomor, and the other evil events of the 20th century. He's also important because he treats the region, the whole of what he calls the bloodlands, the zone of totalitarianism and war in Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union in the 1930s and 40s. He treats this as an historical arena with very important interacting dynamics. These are not 2 or 3 separate storylines which ought to be considered separately. Rather, the events which occurred and the dynamics which led to those events are interlocking. Third, he makes it very clear that the human catastrophes of the final solution, the war upon the Jews, the effort to exterminate the Jews, and Stalin's vast schemes of murder, dehumanization, and the Gulag, that these human catastrophes are interlinked in many ways. And finally, I especially admire Timothy Snyder for his honesty, his insistence on the unqualified priority of honest historical rendering of these events. This is really an exceptional quality in a discipline which is itself committed to honesty. Snyder, as you've seen in reading the book, believes that an important part of the history of the Holocaust is Hitler's ideology. And Hitler's ideology is both the creation of one deranged man, but also the creation of the moment of time in history that Hitler's ideas developed during World War I and then into the Weimar Republic. First of all, it's guided by a kind of anti-Semitism which goes way beyond the kind of folk anti-Semitism which was often found in Europe. This is a fundamental, you might even say metaphysical, all-encompassing anti-Semitism which preoccupies Hitler. Second is the idea that Hitler has that Germany cannot be the great and premier country in the world without achieving Lebensraum, or living space. It needs to have more agricultural land, more access to industrial resources, energy resources, and it can only get that additional bundle of resources through warfare and through theft. And so he has a vision of the colonization. It's a crazy thought, really, but the colonization of Eastern Europe, of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, big parts of the Soviet Union, including the extermination of the Jews of Europe and of the Slavic peoples. A third major idea which motivates Nazi doctrine, National Socialist doctrine, and Hitler personally is anti-communism and anti-Bolshevism. And then the combination of these two ideas, the anti-Semitism with the anti-communism, into the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, the idea that Jews are communists and communism is a Jewish conspiracy. And it's worth underlining that the final solution in Nazi ideology and Hitler's ideology was vastly more than simply a cultural prejudice, and it was implacably murderous. Its goal was nothing less than the extermination of the Jews as a whole people. Hitler was also very clear in Mein Kampf in his complete and total and complete rejection of any ideas of ethics, pity, or compassion, which he regarded as legacies of Jewish inheritance. If you take a look at this map, the scope of Hitler's ambition for world domination is simply staggering. You see that he had in mind to dominate all of Europe and most of the Soviet Union all the way to the Volga River, but also much of Africa and half of North America all the way to the Mississippi River. So his goals of world domination were incredibly extensive. He and the Nazi regime was a completely ruthless and murderous and violent regime. One thing which Snyder talks about a little bit is what was referred to as a hunger plan. I'll quote from Snyder: "A hunger plan created under the authority of Hermann Goering foresaw that many tens of millions of people in this territory, basically the Ukraine, will become superfluous and will die or must emigrate to Siberia." So there was the idea that German war against the Soviet Union and against Ukraine would deliberately and purposefully lead to the mass starvation of many millions of Ukrainian people, Soviet citizens, and human beings. There's also the question, why did Germany and why did Hitler, why did the Nazi regime feel such a compulsion to go to war with Poland? Is it simply an aggressive impulse? And there are two reasons which Snyder emphasizes. One, that Poland was the home to the majority of Europe's Jews. So if Hitler wants to annihilate the Jews of Europe, Poland is a natural target. But secondly, Poland geopolitically stood between Germany and the Soviet Union. And then finally, Snyder underlines the point that Germany and Hitler harbored the historical resentment that large parts of what was then part of Polish territory had at one point been traditionally German territory. The seizure of power by Hitler is a very important part of this story. We might say no Hitler, no final solution. I'll read this passage because it tells in a very short number of words, very small number of words, a tragic political development. In 1933, Hitler emerged triumphant from democratic elections during a long German constitutional crisis that had already centered power in the office of the chancellor. His National Socialist Party, which had won only 12 seats in parliament in 1928, claimed a staggering 230 in July 1932, falling to 196 in November 1932. Hitler was named chancellor of a coalition government in 1933, supported by conservatives and nationalists who believed that they could control him. This was an error. Hitler used the arson of the parliament building in February to limit the rights of German citizens and create a permanent state of exception that permitted him to rule without parliamentary oversight. And shamefully, German politicians and legislators permitted this. I've referred a number of times to the Holodomor, the other period of massive killing, massive cruelty, massive evil in the bloodlands in the middle of the 20th century, the first third of the 20th century. The Holodomor refers to Stalin's forced collectivization of the land of the Ukraine. Collectivization was part of Stalin's vision of Soviet-style communism, collective ownership of the land, and then agriculture as a form of industry, basically. It's not surprising that farmers and peasants resisted collectivization, and Stalin undertook a politically enforced and militarily enforced campaign of starvation against the Ukraine. There were 3.33 million deaths by starvation in 1933 to 1934. And on top of the Holodomor and the starvation campaign, there was the Great Terror in the Soviet Union in the period of 1935, 36, 37, in which hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens were shot in purges as Polish spies, as disloyal to the Soviet Union. Snyder refers to Zionism as one important kind of political movement in Poland, in Western Europe, and in Germany. So what is Zionism? It was a European movement in the 1920s and 30s that aimed to establish a homeland and state for the Jews of Europe. And in an odd way, it had support both from anti-Semites and also from Jews themselves. Quoting from Snyder, Zionism was the Jewish political movement active for half a century, whose advocates identified the future of the Jewish people with the settlement of Palestine and the establishment of a state. But Eichmann was himself, for a period of time, responsible for attempting to arrange the resettlement of Germany's Jews to Palestine as what you might call an exercise of Zionism. One of the things which Snyder adds to the history of the Holocaust and the dynamics of the Holocaust is his emphasis on the importance that the destruction of state power, the destruction of the rule of law played in the sudden opportunity to kill millions of Jews and other peoples in Central and Eastern Europe. This began, well, probably in many places, but one place it began was in Austria in the Anschluss, 1938. Hitler's takeover of Austria and the imposition almost immediately, within days, of anti-Semitic policies and laws. And these laws were much more draconian, much more severe than the counterpart laws in Germany at that time, simply because the legal protections of Jews in Austria were swept away by the Anschluss. In fact, Austria itself was swept away. Austria was erased. Quote, the end of the Austrian state brought violence against Austrian Jews in 5 weeks that was comparable to the suffering that German Jews had endured under Hitler over the course of 5 years. And in fact, Snyder believes that the collapse of the Austrian state led to the immediate collapse of the laws and citizenship rights that protected the status and safety of Austrian Jews. Another important quote from Snyder, in 1935, German Jews had been reduced to second-class citizens. In 1938, some Nazis discovered that the most effective way to separate Jews from the protection of the state was to destroy the state. Any legal discrimination would be complicated by its unforeseen consequences for other aspects of the law and in bureaucratic practice. Even matters that might seem simple, such as expropriation and emigration, proceeded rather slowly in Nazi Germany. When Austria was destroyed, by contrast, Austria's Jews no longer enjoyed any state protection and were victimized by a majority that wished to distance itself from the past and align itself with the future. Statelessness opened a window of opportunity for those who were ready for violence and theft. And it is one of the central theses that Snyder puts forward, is that this story is repeated in the Baltic states, in Poland, and Ukraine in the years to come. The events which occurred in 1938, 1939 are horrendous and dramatic, but Kristallnacht, the day and night in which Jews in Berlin and other German cities were attacked, Jewish businesses were attacked, several hundred Jews were killed in the streets by mobs. That took place in November 1938. The crisis over Czechoslovakia, where Hitler had made territorial claims against Czechoslovakia with regard to the Sudetenland. This was resolved by an agreement by the Western powers to cede the Sudetenland to Germany. Then in 1939, the Blitzkrieg invasion by Germany of Poland and the brutal, ruthless treatment of Poland by Germany. Quoting from Snyder, the German invasion of Poland was undertaken on the logic that Poland did not had not and could not exist as a sovereign state. Soldiers taken prisoner could be shot, since the Polish army could not really have existed as such. Once the campaign was over, what began was not an occupation, since by Nazi logic, there was no prior polity whose territory could be occupied. Poland was a geographic designation, meaning land to be taken. One of the relatively rapid developments in Poland was the Nazi effort to move Poland's Jews. And Poland was the country with the largest number of Jews in all of Europe. And the effort to move Jews into ghettos in the cities of Poland, including especially Warsaw, Krakow, and other major cities. Quoting, "The creation of ghettos in the cities meant a basic transformation of the Polish landscape. Jews who had been almost everywhere in pre-war Poland, including in the countryside, were now concentrated in a small number of urban neighborhoods. This made possible the theft by Germans of all the Jewish property that they could take, as well as the rape of Jewish girls and women." This is a photograph from the Warsaw Uprising late in the war. This man is shortly to be shot by the Nazi soldiers standing behind him. Janina Bauman is a Polish intellectual who survived the war and survived. She was a Jew, but she survived the war. She survived confinement in the Warsaw Ghetto, and she married a man who became a very important Polish intellectual, sociologist, and military officer, Zygmunt Bauman. Here are a few lines from her memoir written 50 years after the fact, her memoir of life in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is one particular instance. "The first 3 days of the Action I spent in the flat, following Julian's firm instructions not to set foot in the street. On the fourth day, I could wait no longer, and ignoring mother's pleas, set out to the little ghetto. At first, the street seemed uncannily quiet, almost deserted. I walked fast, not looking around, quick, along Lesno Street, until I plunged into the tangle of narrow lanes leading to Roman's flat. There, all of a sudden, I found myself in the middle of a panic-stricken crowd. In a little square a score of men, both Jewish policemen and civilian helpers, tried to hold a swarm of screaming people inside a ring of tightly locked hands. Other policemen ran up and down the back alley, searching for more victims, pulling them violently along, pushing them by force into the ring. Just concealed behind a large building, 2 lorries waited for their human load. A couple of Nazi soldiers leaned leisurely against them, their guns ready to fire. They watched the roundup lazily, talking and laughing in the bright sunshine of the midsummer day." This is a chilling description by a young teenage girl of a roundup of Jews in the ghetto, and the people who are being taken away to be killed. There's a phrase which Snyder uses, double occupation. This is one reason why it's so important to understand that both Nazi actions and Soviet actions had a dynamic interaction with each other. The double occupation of Central Europe and Eastern Europe refers to the fact that some of these lands went back and forth between Soviet occupation, which was brutal and murderous, to Nazi occupation, which was brutal and murderous, and back to Soviet occupation. Quoting, "Germans found the conditions where, quote, one could do as one pleased, where they could kill Jews in large numbers for the first time in 1941 as they invaded the Soviet Union. It was in the zone of double occupation, where Soviet rule preceded German, where the Soviet destruction of interwar states, including in the Baltic countries, was followed by the German annihilation of Soviet institutions, that a final solution took place." This is one of his central ideas, that the destruction of political institutions and the institutions of the rule of law were a crucial ingredient in the possibility of the final solution, that is the killing of mass numbers of innocent Jewish people. But let's talk about Soviet repression and atrocity in Poland and elsewhere during basically the same period of time. We've already talked about the Holodomor a little bit and the mass starvation campaign of the 1930s, earlier 1930s. But when the Soviets invaded Western Poland, invaded from Eastern Soviet Union, the Soviets, I've got that reversed. It's the eastern part of Poland invading from the western part of the Soviet Union. The Soviets used massive brutality, massive arrests, and massive murder in Eastern Poland under the Red Army. Quoting, unlike the Germans, the Soviets had mechanisms for and experience with large-scale deportations. Rather than colonial fantasies, they had time-tested destinations, the vast network of prison camps and special settlements known as the Gulag. This is an important term that you've run into for the first time in your readings anyway, the Gulag. This system of prison camps, often work to death camps, in which the enemies of the Soviet state were sent. And the Soviet Union and Stalin had special distrust for and hostility towards the Poles. And so Soviet behavior in Eastern Poland was quite severe. This culminated in the massacre at Katyn Forest, quoting, from the Soviet perspective, the most dangerous Polish group was the officer class. It represented a threefold threat. It was the leadership of an enemy army. Some of its senior officers were veterans of campaigns against the USSR, and its reserve officers represented the Polish educated classes. The Soviets saw the Polish educated classes as the basis for the Polish political nation. The immediate aim of the arrest and elimination of such people was to make political resistance more difficult. And so the Soviets sent teams of secret police, political police, to capture large numbers of army officers and other politically prominent Poles, arrest them, gather them together, and eventually kill them. In April 1930, 21,892 Polish officers were shot by NKVD officers in Katyn Forest and other sites. This was an immense tragedy for Poland. This was the massacre at Katyn Forest. NKVD was the Soviet secret police. And just, it is interesting to know that the fathers and uncles of both Zygmunt Bauman and Janina Bauman, whom I just quoted, were both killed in this massacre of Polish officers. What about the Baltic countries, other countries under occupation by German forces? Quoting, Latvia and Lithuania were similar in that they were small countries, 2 and 3 million respectively, with substantial Jewish populations governed by authoritarian regimes whose policies were tolerant by the standards of Europe of the late 1930s. Their fates were brought together in June 1940, when the Soviet Union took advantage of the terms of its alliance with Nazi Germany to occupy and annex them both. Very quickly, the Soviets decapitated the Latvian and Lithuanian political classes, deporting to the Gulag most of the leaders who had not already fled. This is exactly parallel to their behavior in Poland, which was to decapitate the leadership class of the Polish army and political leadership. So this was an effect of double occupation. Let's dwell on that a little bit. The fact of Soviet occupation created patterns of collaboration between Soviet secret police agencies and local people, local officials, local police. I'm now quoting Snyder. As a result, the murderous politics that emerged was a joint creation of Germans and locals, each of whom was performing the undoing of Soviet power, but with different ideas of what that power had been and with different interests. To be sure, the coordination of actors with different experiences, perceptions, and goals is what politics is about. The politics of the greater evil was a common creation at a time of chaos. This is an important point because in Latvia and Lithuania and in Ukraine, many of the collaborators whom the Germans found to be eager and willing to collaborate in their repression and oppression of the Jews were people who had resisted Soviet occupation. It's also worth just underlining here, I won't comment on it further, that Snyder offers a narrative of the town in Poland, Jedwabne, which is a little bit different from that offered by Jan Gross, which we're going to talk about later in the semester. So it might be worth coming back to those passages in a couple of weeks. In Latvia, the collaboration between local commandos, local militias, local non-German forces, and the German army was brought to a very destructive point of effectiveness. Specially recruited militias or auxiliary police forces were gathered by a man named Araj to serve as mobile mass execution teams. Quoting, of the 66,000 or so Jews living in Latvia in summer 1941, the Araj commando shot about 22,000, a third, in other words, and more than assisted in the killing of some 28,000 more. Like other murderers serving German policy, and like the German murderers themselves, they killed whom they were assigned to kill. Like all of the mass murderers of Jews, they also murdered non-Jews. So these Latvian commandos killed, putting it all together, more than 2/3 of the Jews of Latvia. We've spoken of Babi Yar, but let's refer to it again. Kiev was a major city in Ukraine. And in September of 1941, the German occupation made the determination to kill all of the Jews of Kiev. Quoting from Snyder, from that point forward, the Jews walked in a cordon made by the German police and dogs to a ravine at Babi Yar, where the German army had prepared trenches for mass shootings. There, Germans, assisted by local collaborators, shot some 33,761 Jews over pits. They took some young Jewish women aside to be raped first. Jekyllin was improving upon his technique of killing. He now deployed what he called the sardine method, in which people were forced to lie down in careful rows in a pit before they were shot. This is horrifying to read, but I think very important to read. Continuing about Latvia, using Germans as the shooters and the Raj commando as the auxiliaries, Jekyllin also had some 14,000 Riga Jews killed at pits in the Letbarsky forest outside the city on November 30th, 1941. 14,000 Jews of Riga, one city, killed in a forest on one day. This is horrifying. So let's make some observations before we close. First, these atrocities, these massacres, these mass killings that we've been describing, these were not pogroms. They were not spontaneous violent outbursts. They were not mindless expressions of ethnic hatred. Rather, they were deliberate state-created policies of murder carried out by German military and police personnel and abetted by collaborators in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, and Lithuania. These descriptions of mass murder are almost unbearable to read. They're very, very difficult to read. And yet the dignity of the victims and the extremity of the evil committed requires us to look at them without blinking. And just to recap the major ideas, the major kind of explanatory ideas which Snyder has introduced to this point, he thinks that Hitler's comprehensive worldview and ideology certainly is a crucial part of the explanation of the final solution, the effort by Germany to exterminate the Jews. But he also believes the strategy of state smashing was a crucial element, which was not an ideological strategy. It was more of a pragmatic strategy. Destroy the laws which protect citizens, and you can attack the citizens with impunity. A third point that he makes very clearly is that the interaction of these two totalitarian and evil regimes throughout this period, from the 1930s through the end of World War II, the interaction between these regimes had horrendous consequences, and each regime created havoc for the peoples that they dominated. And then finally, Snyder makes it very clear, as we've seen in The Ravine, and as we will see elsewhere in other materials that we read in the next 6 weeks or so, that the involvement of apparently ordinary men in mass murder is really striking, and we just have to take notice of it. That we cannot dismiss or reduce the seriousness of the evil of the Holocaust by saying it was a few fanatics, it was a few psychopaths, sociopaths who did this, but no, rather it was vast numbers of ordinary men who were willing to commit atrocious murder of hundreds of thousands, eventually millions, of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, handicapped people, elderly people, and children.